In the pre-dawn hours of April 12, 1945, somewhere on the coral ridges of Okinawa, a Japanese officer sat hunched in darkness, his bamboo pen moving across rice paper with trembling hands. The words he scratched out that night would become one of the most remarkable military intelligence documents of the Pacific War, though few would ever read it. He was documenting something his military training had told him was impossible, something that violated 3 decades of accepted tactical wisdom. The Americans had demonstrated the ability to kill Japanese soldiers at 70 yards distance in absolute darkness, without any visible muzzle flash, without illumination of any kind. His infiltrators were being picked off with precision that defied every principle of night combat that the Imperial Japanese Army had developed since the turn of the century. What made this report so extraordinary was not just what it described, but what it represented. For nearly 3 years of brutal Pacific warfare, Japanese forces had dominated the night. Their night-fighting tactics, refined and perfected through conflicts dating back to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, had given them a decisive advantage against Allied forces from the jungles of Guadalcanal to the mountains of Burma. American and Allied commanders had learned to fear darkness, knowing that when the sun went down, Japanese infantry became twice as deadly. But on this particular coral ridge on Okinawa, everything had changed. American troops were engaging enemy soldiers in pitch blackness with an accuracy that seemed impossible, that seemed to transcend the limitations of human vision. The Japanese 62nd Division's elite night assault unit had been systematically destroyed, each man killed by precise carbine fire from positions that should have been shooting blind into darkness. The attacking force had moved with the confidence born of years of successful night operations. They had trained for this, practiced these exact movements thousands of times. Every man knew his role, understood the principles of silent movement through darkness, trusted in the superiority of Japanese night-fighting doctrine. They expected to overwhelm American positions the same way they had overwhelmed enemy positions dozens of times before. Instead, they walked into a slaughter. No star shells lit the sky to reveal their positions. No searchlights swept across the coral. No illumination flares drifted down on parachutes. Just accurate, deliberate fire from invisible enemies who somehow knew exactly where each Japanese soldier was moving. The survivors who made it back to Japanese lines were shaken in a way that went beyond normal combat stress. They had encountered something that fundamentally challenged their understanding of warfare. The American forces had deployed a weapon system so secret that most American soldiers didn't know it existed. The T3 carbine, which would later receive the military designation M3, had been fitted with what the Army called a Sniperscope, though it was far more than just an improved optical sight. This revolutionary infrared night vision system allowed soldiers to see clearly in complete darkness at ranges from 70 to 125 yards. The technology was so closely guarded that only specially selected marksmen received training on the system, and they were expressly forbidden from discussing the equipment with anyone, even fellow American troops. The security measures surrounding this technology were extraordinary, reflecting just how valuable the military considered this capability. What made the weapon system so devastating was not just that it worked, but that the Japanese had no idea such technology even existed. Their entire tactical doctrine had been built on the assumption that darkness was neutral ground where superior training and warrior spirit would prevail. The Americans had violated that fundamental assumption, transforming darkness from Japan's greatest advantage into a killing field where only one side could see. The transformation happening in night warfare was not occurring in massive dramatic battles that would make headlines. It was happening in the darkness, in small engagements where Japanese soldiers were learning the terrible truth that their most reliable tactical advantage had been rendered obsolete by American technological innovation. The scope of this change cannot be overstated. For the Japanese military, night combat superiority was not just a tactic, it was a core element of their military identity, embedded deep in their institutional memory through decades of successful application. The roots of Japanese night fighting excellence stretched back through military history. After the Meiji Restoration modernized Japan's military, the Imperial Army had deliberately emphasized night operations as a way to offset Western technological superiority in artillery and small arms. During the siege of Port Arthur in 1904, Japanese night attacks had achieved the seemingly impossible, overrunning Russian fortifications that had been considered impregnable. The doctrine was not improvised or theoretical. It was built on actual battlefield success, then refined through decades of combat experience in China, Manchuria, and throughout the expansion of the Japanese Empire. Night infiltration and night assault had become the signature of Japanese tactical excellence, the area where they could claim genuine superiority over any opponent. The captured Japanese military manual on night fighting, translated by American intelligence analysts in 1944, was remarkably revealing about the Japanese military mindset. It stated explicitly that night leveled all technical superiority, that in darkness the warrior's spirit and superior training could overcome any mechanical advantage the enemy possessed. One trained Japanese soldier operating at night, the manual claimed, was worth 10 enemies who relied on technology and firepower. This was not empty propaganda designed to boost morale. The doctrine was based on demonstrated battlefield success across multiple conflicts and theaters of operation. At Guadalcanal in 1942, Japanese night attacks had very nearly succeeded in pushing the Marines completely off the island. The desperate battles around Edson's Ridge and Henderson Field were won by such narrow margins that Marine commanders privately admitted the Japanese tactics had nearly worked. Colonel Merritt Edson, writing his after-action report, described how Japanese forces moved through darkness like ghosts, forcing Marines to fire at sounds, at shadows, at their own imaginations, while the Japanese troops navigated the darkness as though born to it. The statistical evidence supported the Japanese confidence in their night fighting abilities. Analysis conducted by the U.S. Army's Operations Research Office examined casualty data from 1942 through 1944 and found that Japanese forces were inflicting 60% of American casualties during night operations, even though night combat represented only 30% of total engagement time. Night infiltration units achieved casualty ratios significantly higher than daylight operations. The mathematics clearly showed that darkness belonged to Japan. Their training regimen for night combat reflected the seriousness with which they approached this tactical advantage. Japanese soldiers spent months training blindfolded, learning to disassemble and reassemble their weapons purely by touch. They practiced moving silently in total darkness, communicating through subtle touches and pre-arranged signals that required no words. They studied the distinctive sounds of American equipment until experienced soldiers could distinguish the mechanical action of an M1 Garand rifle from a Browning automatic rifle at 50 yards based solely on sound. This was not casual training. This was the systematic development of tactical expertise built over years. The revolution that would destroy this Japanese advantage had not begun on any battlefield. It started in American research laboratories where the National Defense Research Committee had recognized the critical need for night vision capability. The Radio Corporation of America, known as RCA, had been working on image intensifier tube technology since the mid-1930s, developing systems that could amplify available light to make faint images visible. By 1943, they had created the 1P25 image intensifier tube, which could convert invisible infrared light into visible images that a human operator could see through a scope. The system they designed consisted of multiple components working together as an integrated weapons system. An infrared spotlight mounted above the carbine barrel emitted light that was invisible to the human eye. A scope containing the image intensifier tube could detect this infrared illumination reflecting off targets and convert it into a visible green-tinted image. A heavy battery pack worn on the soldier's back provided power to the entire system, connected to the weapon through an electrical cable. The complete system added approximately 28 to 30 pounds of weight to a soldier's combat load, which was substantial, but it provided something that had no price in combat operations. It gave the operator the ability to see and engage enemy targets in complete darkness with accuracy comparable to daylight shooting. The T3 carbine, in its experimental configuration, later standardized and designated as the M3, was essentially a modified M2 carbine fitted with this infrared vision system. During testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, trained operators achieved 80% hit rates on man-sized targets at 70 yards in total darkness. This represented revolutionary accuracy for night combat, where normally soldiers were firing blind, hoping to hit targets they could only hear or sense. The effective range of the system varied based on conditions, from 70 yards in poor atmospheric conditions to 125 yards under ideal circumstances. Compared to the alternative, which was firing blindly into darkness and hoping to hit something, this capability was transformative. Production of the infrared Sniperscope began in limited quantities during late 1944. RCA manufactured approximately 1,700 of the sophisticated scopes during World War II, and around 150 complete T3 or M3 weapon systems reached the Pacific Theater by spring 1945, just in time for the invasion of Okinawa. The weapons arrived with security protocols that were unusually strict even by military standards. Only specially selected marksmen with proven reliability received training on the system. They were absolutely forbidden from discussing the equipment with anyone, including other American forces. The operators understood that if they were in danger of being overrun, their first responsibility was to destroy the equipment rather than allow it to be captured. Each infrared system came with thermite grenades specifically for that purpose, indicating how highly the military valued keeping this technology secret. The Battle of Okinawa, which began on April 1, 1945, would become the first major combat test of this infrared night vision technology under actual battlefield conditions. The US Army units conducting the invasion, particularly the 96th Infantry Division and the 7th Infantry Division, received the first shipments of T3 carbines in early April, right at the beginning of the campaign. Distribution was carefully limited, with typically only 2 infrared-equipped carbines assigned to each rifle company in sectors where Japanese night infiltration was expected to be a serious problem. The official Army history of the Okinawa campaign, titled Okinawa, the Last Battle, noted that the infrared Sniperscope proved immediately effective against Japanese night infiltration tactics. The 96th Infantry Division's after-action report stated that enemy night infiltration, which had previously been their most serious tactical problem, had been largely neutralized by the new equipment, allowing engagement of targets in darkness. That first night of actual combat operations, the night of April 1st into April 2nd, 1945, Japanese forces launched their traditional night infiltration attacks against American positions. These were attacks of the type that had been devastatingly effective throughout the entire Pacific War, refined tactics that the Japanese had perfected through years of combat. What they encountered was a completely new reality. American soldiers equipped with the infrared Sniperscopes could clearly see Japanese soldiers moving through what the attackers believed was concealing darkness. The report from the 7th Infantry Division described the psychological impact on enemy forces, noting that they exhibited confusion and disorganization when engaged by accurate fire in total darkness, and that traditional infiltration tactics were abandoned after the initial casualties. The infrared system functioned on a principle that was both simple and revolutionary in its application. The infrared spotlight, which was essentially a sealed beam lamp with a special infrared filter, projected a cone of invisible light up to 150 yards ahead of the weapon position. This infrared light reflected off objects, terrain, and enemy soldiers, and was then captured by the scope's image intensifier tube. The 1P25 tube manufactured by RCA amplified this reflected infrared light and converted it to visible wavelengths, presenting the operator with a green-tinted but remarkably clear image of the battlefield. Technical Sergeant John Murray of the 96th Infantry Division was one of the first soldiers trained on the Sniperscope system. In an interview he gave to the Army's Center of Military History in 1985, 4 decades after the events, he described what it was like to use this technology in actual combat. Looking through the scope at night was unlike anything he had ever experienced, he said. Japanese soldiers appeared as bright green figures against darker backgrounds. You could see their faces clearly, see their rank insignia, identify what weapons they were carrying. The Japanese soldiers moved carefully and professionally, using excellent light infantry tactics that demonstrated their training and skill. But they had absolutely no idea that American soldiers could see them. The psychological advantage this provided was every bit as significant as the technological advantage. Murray continued in his interview, explaining that the Japanese had owned the night for 3 years of warfare. They moved with complete confidence in the darkness, and watching them through the scope, you could see that confidence reflected in their movements, in their body language. Then American soldiers would fire, and you would see the confusion spread through the survivors, see the panic set in. They simply could not understand how American forces could see them in total darkness. The infrared spotlight that made all this possible was completely invisible to the naked eye, which meant Japanese forces never saw the beam that was illuminating them. Operators received training to fire single-aimed shots or short controlled bursts, then immediately relocate to a different position. This made effective counterfire impossible, even if Japanese forces could determine the general direction that incoming fire was coming from. Within just 1 week of the invasion beginning, Japanese night operations on Okinawa had decreased dramatically across the entire front. The Japanese 32nd Army, which was responsible for defending Okinawa under the command of General Mitsuru Ushijima, had planned extensive night counterattacks as a central part of their defensive strategy. These carefully developed plans were largely abandoned after the casualties and confusion of the first week's night operations. Colonel Hiramichi Yahara, who served as the senior operations officer for the 32nd Army and was one of the very few senior Japanese officers to survive the battle, wrote about this in his post-war memoir published in 1973 under the title The Battle for Okinawa. He described how Japanese night assault units, which had never failed in 3 years of warfare across the Pacific, were being systematically eliminated before they could even reach American lines. The Americans possessed some capability that Japanese forces did not understand, could not counter, and could not develop effective tactics against. While Yahara's memoir does not specifically mention infrared technology, and he likely never learned the exact nature of the American capability that was defeating his night assault units, he documented in detail the complete breakdown of Japanese night operations as an effective tactic. Units that had specialized in night combat and had built their entire tactical identity around night fighting superiority were refusing to leave their caves and defensive positions after dark. The sophisticated infiltration tactics that had been refined and perfected over decades of combat experience were simply abandoned. Soldiers who had trained their entire military careers for night operations were no longer willing to operate at night. The U.S. Army's Operations Research Office calculated that during just the first week of combat on Okinawa, the relatively small number of infrared-equipped units accounted for approximately 30% of all Japanese casualties inflicted by small arms fire during night operations, despite the fact that these special weapons represented less than 1% of total American weapons systems on the island. This extraordinary effectiveness ratio led to rapid and dramatic changes in Japanese tactical approaches. The declassified technical reports from 1945 reveal both the impressive capabilities and the significant limitations of the infrared Sniperscope system. The device operated effectively in complete darkness, which was its primary purpose, but it had several important constraints that Japanese forces, not understanding the technology, never discovered or learned to exploit. The battery system, which used heavy lead-acid cells similar to automobile batteries of that era, limited continuous operation to approximately 20 to 30 minutes, though intermittent use could extend operational time to several hours before requiring battery replacement. The weight of nearly 30 pounds for the complete system made rapid movement extremely difficult for operators, who were essentially functioning as fixed-position specialists rather than mobile infantry who could maneuver quickly. Weather conditions significantly affected performance, with heavy rain reducing the effective range to under 40 yards due to the scattering of infrared light by water droplets. Fog and smoke scattered infrared light as well, creating halos around the light source that obscured targets rather than illuminating them. White phosphorus, which was commonly used in combat operations for marking and screening, rendered the system temporarily useless when present in significant concentrations. However, Japanese forces, being completely unaware of the nature of the technology they were facing, never systematically tested these conditions or developed tactics to exploit the system's weaknesses. The infrared spotlight, while invisible to the naked eye under normal circumstances, could theoretically be detected by anyone looking directly at the emission point through certain optical devices that had specially coated lenses. Some Japanese naval binoculars actually had optical coatings that would have allowed detection of infrared light sources, but Japanese forces never realized this theoretical capability existed and never developed any detection procedures or protocols. As the Okinawa campaign progressed through April and into May, American forces refined their tactical use of the infrared sniperscopes based on combat experience. The 7th Infantry Division developed a technique they called infrared ambush, which involved positioning the devices to provide coverage of likely infiltration routes, including trails, water sources, and gaps in wire obstacles. These positions would remain completely dark and silent until Japanese forces entered the designated kill zone, then engage with devastating accuracy. The 96th Infantry Division's after-action report described their employment methodology in detail. Sniperscope operators were positioned to provide interlocking fields of observation across the defensive perimeter. Primary sectors of responsibility were assigned with deliberate overlap to ensure complete coverage of the defensive frontage without gaps. Operators engaged targets of opportunity, while also reporting larger formations for engagement by artillery or mortar fire. Another tactical innovation was the use of psychological warfare through selective engagement. Some infiltration attempts would be allowed to pass through certain areas unmolested, while others in different sectors were completely eliminated with precision fire. This randomness and unpredictability created paralyzing uncertainty among Japanese forces, who never knew whether American forces were watching them at any given moment or from which positions. The limited number of devices available, approximately 150 for the entire Okinawa operation covering tens of thousands of American troops, meant that careful tactical distribution was essential. Priority for infrared equipment went to sectors where night infiltration was considered most likely to occur, including gaps in defensive lines, critical supply routes, water points where Japanese forces might attempt to resupply, and approaches to command posts and critical communication nodes. The scarcity of the equipment actually enhanced its psychological effectiveness by creating uncertainty about where the capability existed. Japanese forces could never be sure whether any given American position had night vision capability, which meant they had to assume every position might be watching them. Japanese military intelligence made desperate attempts to understand the nature of the American night fighting capability that was destroying their operations. Captured Japanese documents from Okinawa, which were translated by the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, known as ATIS, reveal various theories about American night fighting capabilities that ranged from the partially correct to the completely fantastic. One intelligence report from the 62nd Division, dated April 20, 1945, speculated that Americans might possess infrared detection equipment similar to devices used for aerial photography. This was remarkably close to the actual truth, showing that Japanese intelligence had the capability to make accurate assessments. However, without understanding the critical detail about the active infrared spotlight component, Japanese forces could not develop effective countermeasures even with this partially correct assessment. The report suggested that movement during rain might degrade the effectiveness of American detection systems, which was actually accurate, but Japanese forces never systematically exploited this vulnerability. Another intelligence report suggested that Americans had developed some kind of drug or pharmaceutical treatment that enhanced night vision in their soldiers, which led to experiments among Japanese troops involving massive consumption of vitamin A, which was known to be important for vision. Some Japanese units tried covering themselves with mud or clay in attempts to reduce their body heat signature, incorrectly assuming that thermal detection technology was involved in the American capability. The most accurate technical assessment came from a captured Japanese technical officer's notebook that suggested Americans were using some form of artificial light source that multiplied available light, though even this relatively accurate assessment missed the infrared component that was central to how the system actually worked. The psychological impact of the infrared capability extended far beyond the limited number of positions where the technology was actually deployed. Japanese units began avoiding night operations throughout the entire Okinawa front, even in sectors where no infrared capability actually existed. The 10th Army's intelligence section noted in their operational summary that the enemy had largely abandoned night infiltration tactics across the board, with prisoners reporting widespread fear of American ability to see in darkness. This capability, whether actually present in any given sector or simply feared to be present, had effectively neutralized what had been the primary Japanese tactical advantage throughout the Pacific War. The collapse of night combat capability had cascading effects throughout the Japanese defensive plan for Okinawa. The strategy developed by the 32nd Army had relied heavily on the ability to move at night to resupply forward positions, evacuate wounded soldiers back to aid stations, and conduct reconnaissance of American positions and movements. Without the ability to move safely in darkness, Japanese forces became increasingly isolated in their defensive positions, unable to coordinate effectively or maintain their defensive network. Supply lines that had been planned to operate exclusively under cover of darkness were severed. Units in forward defensive positions died from lack of supplies, ammunition, food, and water, not because American forces had overrun them, but because they could not be resupplied. The sophisticated defense in depth that Japanese planners had designed for Okinawa, which depended on lateral movement and mutual support between positions, collapsed into isolated pockets of resistance that could be reduced one by one. The fear of American night vision capability, whether that fear stemmed from actual encounters with infrared-equipped positions or simply from rumors and uncertainty, contributed significantly to the acceleration of the entire campaign. Defensive positions that might have held out for weeks if properly supplied and coordinated were instead isolated and reduced in days. Japanese forces retreated deeper into the extensive cave systems that honeycombed Okinawa's limestone terrain, systems that had been prepared as defensive positions but now became the only refuge from American observation during darkness. The training materials for infrared sniperscope operators, which were declassified in the 1990s, reveal the thoroughness of American preparation for employing this new technology. Operators underwent 40 hours of specialized training that covered the theory of infrared light and image intensification, equipment maintenance and troubleshooting procedures, target identification and range estimation using the green-tinted imagery, battery management and power conservation techniques, tactical employment and proper positioning, and security procedures to prevent capture of the equipment. The technical manual, designated TM 5-9341 and titled Sniperscope Set Infrared M2, emphasized repeatedly that operators were required to destroy the equipment rather than allow it to be captured under any circumstances. Each device included thermite grenades specifically for equipment destruction if a position was in danger of being overrun. This extreme security measure provides insight into how valuable the military considered this technology to be. Operators were carefully selected from among expert marksmen who also demonstrated emotional stability and the ability to work independently. The psychological burden of killing enemy soldiers who could not see the operator and had no ability to fight back was recognized early in the training program. Training materials emphasized that operators were saving American lives by preventing infiltration, not simply executing helpless enemies. This framing was considered important for maintaining operator mental health and effectiveness. The American infrared Sniperscope was not developed in complete isolation from other nations' efforts. German forces had been developing parallel technology with their ZG-1229 system, which they called Vampire, designed for use with the STG-44 assault rifle. However, the German system saw only extremely limited deployment in the final months of the war in Europe, primarily used by Panzer Grenadier units during the Battle of the Bulge and during fighting along the Rhine River crossings.
The American achievement was not just in developing the technology itself, but in successfully deploying it in significant numbers to a theatre of operations on the opposite side of the world from where it was manufactured, training enough operators to make tactical difference, and maintaining operational security so tight that the enemy never understood what they were facing. The Japanese military, despite having their own highly advanced optical industry with companies like Nippon Kogaku that would later become Nikon, had not pursued infrared technology for infantry applications. This technological gap represented a broader pattern that characterized the Pacific War. While Japanese forces often displayed superior training and superior tactics in specific areas like night combat, American industrial capacity and technological innovation could rapidly neutralize these advantages once they were identified as priority problems. The infrared Sniperscope was a perfect example of this pattern, representing a technological solution to what had been a serious tactical problem. While many specific Japanese testimonies about encountering infrared technology remain unverified or may have been created as composite accounts for narrative purposes, American combat reports provide clear and unambiguous evidence of the technology's battlefield effectiveness. The 7th Infantry Division's regimental journals from April 1945 contain numerous entries describing successful night engagements at ranges that would have been previously impossible in darkness. One verified account from the 96th Infantry Division describes an engagement that occurred on April 15, 1945. The Sniperscope operator engaged an enemy patrol of approximately 12 individuals at 23:30 hours, which is 11:30 p.m. in military time. The range was approximately 75 yards. 8 enemy soldiers were killed and the remainder fled into the darkness. There were no friendly casualties.
Enemy forces showed no awareness of observation before the engagement commenced, meaning they had no idea they were being watched. Another report from the 7th Infantry Division, dated April 28, 1945, described how an infrared-equipped position reported and engaged an enemy supply party moving along a trail designated as Trail 3 at 02:30 hours in the morning. 6 enemy soldiers were killed, and supplies they were carrying were destroyed by subsequent mortar fire that was directed by the Sniperscope operator, who could continue observing the target area. The report noted that enemy forces had not attempted to use that particular trail during subsequent nights, indicating they had learned to avoid it. Unable to operate effectively on the surface at night, Japanese forces retreated deeper into Okinawa's extensive cave systems, both natural caverns and artificial tunnels that had been prepared as defensive positions. These underground networks now became the only refuge from American night observation capabilities. Colonel Yahara's memoir describes this forced adaptation in stark terms. Japanese forces were reduced to remaining in caves during darkness, he wrote. Surface movement was authorized only during daylight hours and only when adequate concealment was available. This complete reversal of traditional Japanese tactics was devastating to unit morale. Soldiers who had built their entire military identity around night-fighting superiority were now hiding underground whenever darkness fell. This forced adaptation into cave systems created its own cascade of serious problems. The tunnel systems, while extensive throughout Okinawa's limestone terrain, were not fully connected into an integrated defensive network. Units became isolated from each other, unable to coordinate operations or share resources effectively. The sophisticated defense in depth that had been carefully planned for Okinawa's defense collapsed into isolated pockets of resistance that had no mutual support. Disease spread rapidly through overcrowded caves where hundreds of soldiers were confined in spaces designed for much smaller numbers. Supplies could not be distributed effectively between positions. Units lost cohesion and organizational structure. The defensive network that was supposed to protect Japanese forces and allow them to inflict maximum casualties on American attackers had become a series of traps where Japanese soldiers were confined. While the infrared sniperscopes did not directly cause all of these problems, they forced the tactical adaptation that led to these conditions by making surface movement at night impossible. The battle for Shuri Castle in late May 1945 demonstrated the complete reversal of night combat dynamics that had occurred on Okinawa. Shuri, an ancient castle that served as General Ushijima's headquarters and the center of Japanese defensive operations, had been planned to be defended through sophisticated night counterattacks that would disrupt American advances. These carefully developed plans were largely abandoned due to the American night vision capability. The 1st Marine Division's official history records that the expected night counterattacks during the Shuri battle never materialized on the scale anticipated. Enemy forces confined offensive action to daylight hours or dawn and dusk periods. Night defensive positions were abandoned without significant fight. Prisoners indicated widespread fear of American night observation capability that made night operations suicidal. By June 1945, as the Okinawa campaign entered its final, desperate phase, Japanese forces had completely and permanently abandoned their traditional night tactics that had served them throughout the war. General Ushijima's final order, issued on June 18, 1945, acknowledged this new reality explicitly. Night surface operations are prohibited except for final defensive stands where survival is not expected, the order stated. This represented the complete abandonment of a doctrine that had been developed over 40 years. The statistics from the entire Okinawa campaign showed the dramatic impact of this technological advantage. American casualties during night operations decreased by 78% in sectors that had infrared coverage compared to casualty rates from early Pacific War battles, where Japanese night tactics had been fully effective. Japanese night operations, which had been their primary tactical advantage and source of combat effectiveness since 1942, effectively ceased to exist as a viable tactic. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, American technical intelligence teams conducted extensive analysis of Japanese responses to the infrared technology they had encountered. The Strategic Bombing Survey, which interviewed captured Japanese military leaders about various aspects of the war, found that while many senior officers were aware that Americans possessed some form of enhanced night vision capability, none of them understood its exact nature or the principles on which it operated. The Far East Command's comprehensive study on Japanese night combat, which was published in 1946, concluded that the introduction of infrared viewing devices had effectively neutralized Japanese night fighting capabilities on Okinawa, and that this single technological advantage disrupted tactical doctrine that had been developed over 40 years of military evolution, contributing materially to the acceleration of the campaign and the reduction of American casualties. Former Japanese officers who were interviewed by occupation forces during the post-war period consistently cited the loss of night combat capability as one of the most demoralizing aspects of the entire Okinawa battle. While they could accept being outgunned in terms of artillery and air support, and while they could understand being outproduced in terms of equipment and supplies, the loss of darkness, where skill and training had always been supposed to prevail over technology and material advantages, struck at the very core of Japanese